You are standing in a Paris street on May 9, 1902. Around you, nearly 10,000 people press in around a mansion on the Avenue de la Grande Armée. They have come to watch a safe be opened. For 20 years, everyone in France believed that inside it sat a fortune of 100 million francs, sealed shut by court order and guarded by the wax seal of a Parisian magistrate. When that seal is finally broken, the safe holds an old newspaper, a single Italian coin, and a brass trouser button. The woman who built an empire on that box is already gone. Her name was Thérèse Humbert, and her weapon was never a gun or a forged banknote. It was a promise that no one was allowed to check. To understand how a laundry maid from a village near Toulouse convinced the bankers of Paris to hand her hundreds of millions of francs, you have to go back to a childhood spent watching her father wave sheets of paper he swore proved he was secretly the son of a noblewoman. She was raised inside a lie about an inheritance. She would spend the rest of her life perfecting one. Marie-Thérèse d'Aurignac was born in September 1855 in the rural village of Auxonne in the dusty vineyard country near Toulouse. Her father, Guillaume d'Aurignac, was an eccentric peasant and a foundling, a man with no known parents and an unshakable conviction that his real blood was noble. He carried forged historical parchments through that poor southern village and claimed to be the hidden son of an aristocrat, a nobleman's secret child cheated of his birthright. There was no birthright. There was a peasant with a sheaf of counterfeit documents. But from the time Therese was small, he was teaching her a single lesson: that wealth could be invented, that a convincing story about who you were could stand in for the money itself, and that a forged piece of paper waved with enough conviction could bend the way people treated you. She learned it well. As a young woman, she worked as a laundry maid, but she had a lively, persuasive charm that money could not buy. To attract suitors, she talked the local girls into pooling their jewelry, then wore it all at once to project the illusion of a fortune she did not have. In 1878, in the nearby town of Beauzelle, she married Frédéric Humbert. He was a lawyer, an amateur artist, and a former radical deputy, and far more importantly, he was the son of Gustave Humbert, a law professor and mayor of Toulouse, who would go on to become the Minister of Justice of France. She won Frédéric with a story. She told him she stood to inherit a fictional estate, the Château de Marcotte, left to her by her dead mother's wealthy lover. He believed her. There was no chateau. But by the time the truth might have mattered, he was already hers, and he stayed. Not a victim so much as a partner. His legal training would become one of the sharpest instruments in the scheme to come. It was Frédéric who would keep the fictitious lawsuits alive for 2 decades, drafting the appeals and countersuits that kept the safe legally sealed and the fortune conveniently unexamined. The story that made her rich began, she said, on a train in 1879. Thérèse claimed she was traveling when she heard groans coming from the next compartment. She said she climbed out along the outside of the moving carriage, pulled herself in through the window, and found an American millionaire in the grip of a heart attack. She revived him with smelling salts and saved his life. His name, she said, was Robert Henry Crawford, and he promised her his eternal gratitude. It should have been unbelievable. A woman scaling the outside of a speeding train to revive a dying stranger belongs in a cheap novel, not a courtroom. But the sheer melodrama of the tale was exactly what disarmed people. It was too theatrical to be a lie, and so they took it for the truth. 2 years later, the will arrived. Crawford, she announced, had died and left her a fortune of 100 million francs. It was an enormous sum. In the money of the day, it was close to 20 million American dollars, and by the buying power of today, the equivalent of roughly 700 million. But there was a catch, and the catch was the genius of the entire fraud. At the same moment she produced Crawford's will, she produced a second will from Crawford's 2 nephews, Robert and Henry, who contested the inheritance. The 2 documents were dated the same day and carried identical signatures. They created a legal deadlock that no court could quickly resolve. To settle the standoff, a Parisian court did something that would cost France a fortune. It ordered the disputed 100 million francs, held in bearer bonds, to be locked inside a safe in Thérèse's own mansion, sealed and sequestered until the lawsuit ended. The terms were strict. If Thérèse so much as opened the safe before the case was resolved, she would forfeit her claim to every franc. And so the safe sat, sealed by the state, in the home of the woman who claimed to own it. This is where the swindle became a machine. A sealed safe, guarded by court order, was better than cash. Bankers did not have to trust Thérèse, they trusted the wax seal of the magistrate. The French state, by ordering the fortune locked away, had unwittingly certified that the fortune existed. Against that certainty, Thérèse began to borrow from bankers, from provincial notaries, from aristocrats, and eventually from ordinary working people, at ruinous rates of interest, using the untouchable 100 million as collateral. Over the 20 years that followed, she put several 100 million francs into circulation this way. Even Credit Lyonnais, one of the largest banks in the country, was drawn into her orbit. Money flowed in from every direction, and almost all of it went straight back out to pay the people she had borrowed from before. She was always borrowing tomorrow's money to silence yesterday's creditor, at interest rates that only deepened the hole with every loan. The scheme could never stop moving because the moment it stopped, the arithmetic would become visible to everyone. To keep the lawsuit alive, she needed the Crawfords to appear real. So her two brothers, Romain and Émile d'Aurignac, became the Crawford nephews. They pulled on false wigs and heavy theatrical makeup, adopted what onlookers called horrible American accents, and showed up in courtrooms and business meetings to argue, threaten, and stall. The performance nearly broke only once. When an exasperated magistrate demanded to know the Crawfords' address in America, Thérèse blurted out 1302 Broadway, a vague, imprecise address that betrayed how little she knew of the country her benefactor supposedly came from. In October 1885, she made the fiction official. She formally launched a slate of lawsuits against the Crawfords, the same Crawfords her brothers were pretending to be, and turned the courtroom itself into an engine of the fraud. The point was never to win. Every appeal, every countersuit, every fresh legal complication bought another year in which the safe had to remain sealed, and another year in which the fortune could not be examined. Thérèse was not fighting a lawsuit. She was farming one, cultivating delay the way another family might have cultivated a vineyard, because delay was the only thing keeping the money invisible and therefore believed. The credibility problem was solved by her marriage. In 1883, when the newspaper Le Matin printed a skeptical exposé questioning whether the fortune was real, her father-in-law stepped in. Gustave Humbert, by then the Minister of Justice of France, publicly vouched for the inheritance. The doubts evaporated. No one could believe that the daughter-in-law of the nation's highest legal officer was running a common swindle. Without his shield, the fraud would have collapsed almost 20 years before it finally did. The money bought a life that Paris could not stop staring at. The Humberts filled a mansion at 65 Avenue de la Grande Armée with priceless art and lavish banquets, and tied pink satin bows to the very brushes in their lavatories. They bought a country chateau. Thérèse held court in enormous hats piled with feathers and fake fruit, one of them so extravagant an observer said it looked like a giant leech slurping at her hair. Through her rooms passed the President of the Republic, the police prefect of Paris, and the writer Marcel Proust. She was no longer the laundry maid from Auxonne. She was La Grande Thérèse. But a fortune that only exists on paper has to be fed every single day, and the feeding was about to become a crime against the public. By the early 1890s, private loans were no longer enough to service the debt. So in 1893, the Humberts opened their own investment bank called La Rente Viagère and began taking money directly from the public. Stripped of its respectability, it was a Ponzi scheme. The deposits of new investors were used to pay the returns promised to older ones. To reassure savers, their brochures carried the images of Pope Leo XIII and the Boer statesman Paul Kruger, neither of whom had given permission to appear on them. These were not aristocrats who could absorb a loss. They were working people, provincial notaries and small savers handing over their money because a bank with a grand name and a papal portrait told them it was safe. This is the mechanism beneath almost every great swindle. Thérèse Humbert had not invented a better lie. She had found a better guarantor. She never asked bankers to trust her word. She let the courts, the press, and the Minister of Justice vouch for her, and then borrowed against their reputations. Financiers assumed that a woman married into the family of the nation's highest legal officer could not possibly be running a pedestrian scam, and that assumption did her lying for her. The safe did not need to contain anything. It only needed to be sealed by someone the victims already trusted. It is the same instinct that makes any of us assume a locked vault must hold something worth locking away, and it is still running today wherever a trusted name is used to certify a fortune no one has actually counted. Keeping the illusion alive demanded theater. When a bailiff arrived one afternoon to seize her property for unpaid debts, Thérèse tore a pearl necklace worth 500,000 francs from her own throat and flung it across the floor. As the bailiff and her creditors dropped to their knees to gather the scattered pearls, the clock struck 5, the legal hour past which no seizure could be carried out in France. They were forced to leave empty-handed, and she had bought herself another day. But some men were not so easily managed. Paul Schatzman, a wealthy industrialist from Lille, had already lent the Humberts around 2 million francs. When they pressed him for 7 million more, he refused. In 1899, Schatzman was found murdered on a train. The killing was never solved, but Romain Dorignac, the family's enforcer, a brawler who would later write up his own colorful adventures abroad, remained the prime suspect. The stakes had stopped being financial. By 1901, the arithmetic could no longer be hidden. The debts had grown faster than any stream of new deposits could cover, and the incoming money finally fell short of what the Humberts owed. An official named Jules Bizat had already investigated Thérèse's claim that her money sat safely in government bonds and found nothing behind it. Enraged creditors went to the courts with a single devastating demand: open the safe. On May 9, 1902, the state prosecutor arrived at the mansion on the Avenue de la Grande Armée. A crowd of thousands had gathered to see the fortune that had ruled Parisian finance for 2 decades. The wax seals were broken. The safe was opened. Inside lay an old newspaper, a single Italian coin, and a brass trouser button. There were no bonds. There had never been any bonds. 100 million francs of collateral had been a newspaper and a button the entire time. The claimed fortune had never existed, but the debt was painfully real. When the accounts were finally tallied, the money owed to ruined creditors ran into the tens of millions of francs. The Humberts were already gone. Anticipating the raid, they had slipped across the border into Spain and vanished into cramped lodgings in Madrid. An international manhunt followed, and in December 1902 they were tracked down, arrested, and extradited to Paris. The people the fraud destroyed, though, were rarely the ones who had gambled and lost. Consider the family of Armand Pereire and his wife. Madame Pereire had worked as the Humberts' trusted housekeeper, and her daughter had married a struggling young painter named Henri Matisse. When the scandal broke, the police and the public needed someone within reach to punish, and they chose the working-class couple who had served in the house. Detectives ransacked Matisse's studio. Armand Pereire was arrested for a crime he had no part in and went on a hunger strike in prison to protest his innocence. Matisse, not yet the icon he would become, was forced to put down his brushes and act as his family's defender to keep them out of the mob's hands. Others did not survive the reckoning. A banker named Girard, ruined by his exposure to the empty safe, shot himself. A Paris notary named Lanquest, who had unknowingly steered his own clients toward the Humbert investments, was so disgraced that he bankrupted his private practice to repay the small lenders he had led to ruin out of his own pocket. These were not faceless institutions. They were the people who had vouched for her because they believed the state already had. The trial opened in Paris in August 1903 and consumed the world's newspapers for 2 weeks. From the moment it began, Thérèse fought for control of the room. She rose in defiance and demanded to be heard. When the questioning turned toward her family, she tried to gather the entire crime onto herself, insisting that she alone had touched the Crawford succession, that her husband was honesty itself, and that her brother Romain was the most loyal and honorable of men. And when the presiding judge pressed her again and again on the one question that mattered, what had ever actually been inside the safe? She refused to answer it. Instead, she complained that she ate only an egg each night, that she slept just 1 hour, that she was too nervous to go on. Her defense fell to Fernand Laborie, the celebrated lawyer who had defended Alfred Dreyfus. His argument was audacious. The bankers, he said, were complicit in their own ruin because no rational financier lends millions against a box he has never been allowed to open. Even Shylock, he told the court, never lent money against an empty strongbox. But Thérèse would not let the fiction die. She still insisted the Crawfords were real, that they merely hid behind a scandalous name, and she shrieked in the courtroom that the name was Renier, trying to drag her invented benefactors into an entirely separate French scandal. She told the jury she had found the Crawfords, and that it was only their name that did not exist. The jury was unmoved. Thérèse and Frédéric were sentenced to 5 years of hard labor, her brothers Romain and Émile to 3 years and 2. There was another verdict too, and the press delivered it. For a decade, they had crowned her La Grande Thérèse, the imposing doyenne in her monstrous hats. Now that the money was gone, the same reporters remade her on the page as something small and grotesque. They called her short, fat, common, and shrewish. They reached for the pseudo-scientific language of the day and described her as degenerate, as unsexed, as a criminal type you could supposedly read in a body. And yet even the reporters who came to despise her could not quite manage it. One who watched her in the courtroom, cataloging her broken nose and square chin, admitted she still radiated an inexplicable charm. The thing that had built the fraud never fully switched off. Thérèse was sent to the women's prison at Rennes, Frédéric to the fortress prison at Thouars, where he kept the prison's financial ledgers and made pearl buttons in the workshop. There was a bleak symmetry to it. The safe that had promised 100 million francs had held, in the end, a single trouser button. And now the husband spent his sentence turning out real buttons by the handful in a prison workshop, while the woman who had once ruled Paris in her monstrous feathered hats was stripped of her wardrobe and set to hard labor in a provincial cell. In September 1906, both were released early for good behavior. And then Thérèse Humbert did the most remarkable thing of her entire career. She disappeared. For decades afterward, encyclopedias printed the same tidy ending, that she had sailed to America with her hidden wealth and died in luxury in Chicago in 1918. It was false. There was no hidden wealth, and she never left France. The truth was quieter and far more bleak. In 1930, one of the original magistrates who had once extradited her from Madrid published an exposé in the magazine Detective, tracking down what had become of her. He located her living in complete obscurity in a modest apartment on the Boulevard de Batignolles, behind white curtained windows. She had lost, he wrote, her miraculous vitality. She was a quite humble old lady, he said, who never spoke to anyone. Census records place her in that apartment with Frédéric, still her husband, until his death in 1937. And then, in 1939, a Paris newspaper printed the final, almost unbearable irony of her life. Thérèse Humbert, the woman who had conjured 100 million franc inheritance out of nothing and gone to prison for it, had just legitimately inherited a modest sum of money. Her brother had died and left it to her. After a lifetime spent forging the fantasy of an inheritance, a real one finally arrived, decades too late to matter, and small enough to vanish into an ordinary life. Prime Minister Waldeck Rousseau had called it the swindle of the century, and for 20 years it had been exactly that. It ruined bankers, drove men to suicide, jailed the innocent, and touched the family of one of the greatest painters who ever lived. And its entire engine was a locked box that everyone agreed not to open, because the state had sealed it, and no one ever dared to check whether the state had sealed anything at all. So tell me in the comments, was Thérèse Humbert the architect of the swindle of the century? Or a girl raised on her father's forged parchments who never learned where the lie ended and the inheritance began? If this was the kind of story you can't look away from, there's another one waiting. Keep watching.